I speak about the Lymbourg of Saint Jerome. This is a somewhat a new name for a painter called the Master of Saint Jerome. And I try not to repeat my book, but to give you one of the ideas how to look at such a book. And I experienced that very beautifully with Till Holger Borchardt when we saw the book for the first time. And that was a very beautiful thing to be together with a great scholar for panel painting and show him a little bit what a manuscript chap could do. So we start with the first point. It is a Parisian book of ours with a close connection to the French court. One of the closest connections to the French court I can find in a book, and that is that on the left-hand side we have a new variant of a famous interior. There are priests, there are monks in a choir, and they make the office of the dead and not the requiem. This is the requiem text. On the other side, you have a priest at the mass we call requiem, and you see certain differences between the two pictures. And the most interesting point of it is that the picture on the left-hand side has been drawn on a double leaf without any ruling, and that proves that there is some sequence between the book block and certain editions. So when the book was made, the artist or the artists had some changes in mind, and whenever we look through these drawings and when you see the reproductions we made, you will always say, oh, there may be a difference in between. And you know this terrible talking of art historians. They come to see a picture and say, painting, and say, oh, they say this is Rembrandt. And I think it's Howard Flink or something. And no, it should be something completely different. In this case, we should at first be very, very moderate and try to find within the book something like a story, not perhaps the real truth, but the principle would be ask questions which should be asked, give answers which are useful to hear. That's my topic today. So we see a king in a choir on the right-hand side. You see him once more here. And that was the way how kings in France were shown to the public when they were dead. They were not shown with a corpse, because that would have been too ugly, but in an effigy. And you see here the effigy of the King of France for a royal requiem. And I just choose to show you a little thing which is also stylistically a tiny, tiny bit connected. The royal, so-called Royal Alexander in London transposes this French custom to Alexander the Great and even puts him into a blue robe as the French king would have been. That means, at first point, this book has such close relations to the French royal court as we never ever find in a second French book of ours, nor for the Requiem, neither for the Requiem, nor for the office of the dead. There are slight things Ines Ville-Lapetite has found in a border in the Mazarin associations like that. But it is at least very, very rare. And that picture is unique. The other is not so unique because it has a very strange parallel. And that is a parallel in a Psalter which is known as the Psalter of Henry VI. And in that Psalter, the pictures are also additions to the original corpus of the book. And we have either the source or repetition of our drawing. And there is a very simple way to show whether this is a repetition, or which one is the repetition of the other. That is, the drawing is much simpler, and there is a second row added here, and we have this very queer tiles on the, and we have a very exaggerated architecture in the Psalter. So the Psalter picture, and we could discuss an hour about it, the Psalter picture is certainly later either than the original design repeated here. That's always one of these beautiful things art historians do. No, it's not the original, it's just the repetition of something which was much greater and unfortunately lost. So let's make it simpler. I'm convinced that is a drawing which shows us the first stage of a church interior which had a certain sequence, and the most important example of it is in the Psalter of Henry VI. And in that you see something very funny. Here we have skulls up there of a pope, an emperor, a king, a queen, and a cardinal. And here we have a pope with a red tiara, a pope with a blue tiara, a French king, a French queen, and a cardinal. Papst Kaiser König is something we know from childhood, and we end with Bettelmann. Pope, king doesn't work. We could now discuss whether pope really means something, but at least the artist made a lot of effort to show this is not an emperor's crown. So this is pointing to the schism. The schism historically ended in 1417. There are possibilities that later people thought about schism. But let me just say, this should not be later than 1417, as Ines Ville-Lapetite, for instance, said. If the left-hand drawing is earlier, it's 600 years old, or a bit later. And the first point is a royal court manuscript, 600 years old. That means in the time span the Limburgs lived. You know, if they had not died, they could have had with us yesterday the 600th anniversary of their dead, together with the Duke of Berry. And now we come to a very important point. The art which is expressed in our book, and I will talk about that later on still, has been studied by very great art historians, Otto Pecht and Millard Mies. And the only excursion in the whole life of Millard Mies into studying manuscripts as manuscripts and not manuscripts as keeping some highlights of art concerns the Psalter of Henry VI. And he found that there is an almanac dated 1420. And that's the origin to say the Master of Saint Jerome and this kind of painting is done in 1420 or 1420. He even says 1421 and in another case 1419. There's no reason. We always know that if you say circa 1420, that would be different. But now we look at it and we see the calendar, which by chance is for 359 entries identical with ours, and only with 6 entries changing positions between saints. So it's the most identical pair of calendars I know in this kind of great manuscripts. This has certainly not been done by the man who did the almanac. So the almanac responds to the fact that Henry VI, when he got the book, was 10 years old, and so they started 1420 with the almanac added. So we dismiss the date, which has no second, for me, no second reason. So I have a daring hypothesis. I am convinced that we have a new manuscript by a great Limburg, and I dare to say the flight to Egypt is by the man who did the February. And in the tradition of the Duke of Berry. And now we have the problem that we could easily do that silly kind of artistry just to put motifs together, and then we would put the angel in the Flight of Egypt to the angel in a picture added to the Petit Sœur, or the donkey in our drawing and the donkey in February. But this is a cheap kind of artistry. We have a true problem for Nijmegen, the Limburgs and so on, incorporated by Hermann Kohlenbrander, who unfortunately is not here. He started to say on the search of the Gebroeders Limburg that the Gebroeders Limburg can't be Gelderlander, but must have been Italians, because it is something like an Italianate art which should be done by a young man, a poor, still something like a boy from Gelders, and this Flight of Egypt between Giovanni di Fra Silvestro, in earlier years the master of the Brussels Initial, and the Belles-Sœurs is in a way an international sensation of the first 2 decades of the 15th century. So, royal book, before 1460, with a strong Italian influence. My real idea of style is something completely different. Camille Corot said, if you want to judge a work of a motive and a work of art, don't look at it for motives, for single items, but look at it in a vaster idea. Close a tiny bit the eyes, and then you see that this marvelous construction of a room with this tapestry-like height of the paint, and this great thing, how we are led through the picture, has very, very much to do with each other. I don't do today Morellian things with putting faces next to each other, but now we look at the history of the book in itself. The first picture is a strange picture because St. John's Gospels, the little Gospel extract, is not introduced with a picture of St. John, but with a church interior, with a genre scene we do not have anywhere else. And that picture, in my conviction, has been planned first as a square, got added the arc, so when the book was done, it was not yet completely clear whether a book of hours should have square pictures, like in the Belles-Heures, with few exceptions, or arch pictures. And when we look at this border, we are far away from the Duke of Berry's time. That must be in the 1460s. And there is also something funny with it. So we have one beginning, one end, and that between are at least 2 generations. I do not speak about a true date. And when you look at this frame and how the column connects with it, you would not have this interior color strip, which is so often or so common in French illumination. The first, and for long generations, the only who just did gold strips were the Limburgs. And when you have complicated books, it helps to look at the different kind of framing, not to think it's a real signature, but a hint. Now, the hint this picture brings is a marvelous one, and we are so sorry that Patricia Stirnemann couldn't come. She has discovered in the Trésor a strong impact of the Duke of Bedford's painter, Ancelin de Haguenau. And she is convinced that this, for instance, is a border by the Bedford master. And Ines, who will speak to us today, Ines Vidal-Appetit, has found sensationally this missal of Louis de Guyenne, a book broken off or abandoned in 1415 by the Bedford master. When you now try, and it's very difficult to get a good picture of this very slight drawing in the Mazarin Missal, when you compare the drawing in the Mazarin Missal and our drawings, you do not find a single one in Heribert Tencher's book, which is as loose. Also, there is a completely different way of being fancy in the Bedford drawings. And we have a hell of a lot of Bedford drawings in the Salisbury Breviary in Paris. So there is first this beautiful question. This picture was for a long time without any border. And that is an unusual way to produce a book. And the most important example of a book where the pictures were conceived first and the borders, which come as little pieces, like us Pfeiffer's pieces. You know, Margaret has studied this single things. That is not a professional border. That is an artist's fantasy, completely alien to what people expected to have. Now we turn the pages in the book, and I can't show you all the pictures. We get to a most extraordinary annunciation at the beginning of the office of the Virgin, and this Annunciation has an architecture so strongly worked out as if the draftsman, during doing this, had completely given up to put color later upon. And he left the figures, marvelous figures, and I know the pictures Christine Seidel will show us. You see that much better on her pictures. These figures, Gabriel and the Virgin, are just great, but only with not executed in more than a very slight drawing. The idea to have a double page with Gabriel and the Virgin turns one's back to the Kohlenbrenner problem, because you find it mostly in Italy, and mostly means 3 times rounded. And always in North Italy. There is one connection very much back, which I do not discuss today, that is to Jean Pucelle and the hours of Jeanne d'Evreux, because a lot of things we have here, the slight format, the grey, leaving the whole thing grey, and the double page for these double pages are typical, and the calendar, and there is also an interesting point about the calendar, because the calendar is arranged in the same way, and as Barbara Drake-Boehm has shown, belongs exactly to the same family of calendar texts. Now, when we discuss borders, we always have an idea with a border you can date, because we do not really trust that we can date by figures and so on. But the Limburgs toy with us in a nasty way. In the Belzer, you see a lot of pictures from Belzer. That is nearly all the Alan Farber stuff with the, here you just see from the reverse this kind of ivy leaf. And first, this page in the Belzer had been decorated with ivy leaf. Then it was a time when even young people had a razor. They took the razor, cut that off, and put this marvelous border into it on full blue ground. So something which we would call a prophecy of the Ghent-Bruges school of much later times. So when we go to this, we have travel memories from Florence, the Porta della Mirandola, and when we look at our borders, we have no right to say, because these borders are so great, so flashy, so full of extreme fantasy, it must be a late thing. The Limburgs could do that. When we then turn a bit more the pages, we get always the same question. Some Milanese or Paduan things, and I hope Victor Schmidt will talk about that also. Michelino da Besozzo in the manuscript has given one idea of how this works. This is taken up, there are more steps between, and it leads to the Trésor of the Duke of Berry, which are in the 1410s, 14, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and there is another typical characteristics of the Limburgs. The Limburgs never really learned how to arrange a book of hours. They were bad students. When we ask our students, what is the animal connected with St. Matthew's, and they say the ox or the Limburgs never learned that. They always mixed it up. So when they looked at this book, they put, this is just a catastrophe for the construction of a book, 2 pictures, one for sixth and one for known to terce. And when you look through the book and try to imagine how could the book have been done, you must finally say, young people, unexperienced in such silly things like how to make a book of hours. But great art. And I think that was the fascination of the Duke of Berry with these boys. When we then turn to the Passion Cycle, we may have a doubt. For a long time I had a doubt whether the Passion Cycle may be by a different artist, and there are some ideas about it, but I'm finally convinced that the Passion Cycle was much simpler conceived already, and they repeated it, but with these repetitions they also did very strange things. They repeated, for instance, 2 scenes from Duccio da Buonisegna in Siena in that one drawing. The whole point is even more interesting when we turn to the crucifixion scenes. You know, since a long time we learned that the Brussels hours of the Duke of Berry have been inventoried in 1402. And we know that the breviary of Jean Sans Peur must have been done before 1419, and we now have a tendency to say this is early and that other is late. It's not at all sad that this is so as late as 1419. But as in true philology of pictures, this can't be an early conception of that picture, because the thieves have been already amputed. And we always say, as you see, I would have here the cross, and I have no arms down. Here we have the arms down, and so there was always the question, and Gerhard Schmidt put a terrible conclusion of it. He said, this book is not at all the book Millard Mies speaks about. It's a book lost by the devil on the road, somewhere done in the 14, tell me what. So this loses its character as a trendsetter. And then we look at it here, and they are not yet amputed. They are the same. And then we could turn much more beautiful examples of it. The most astonishing part are the suffrages. And in the suffrages we find an especially interesting point which is known from the Belles-Heures. That is, certain topics, certain texts in the Belles-Heures, only masses and hours, not suffrages, get more than one picture in a way that one picture gets a big initial and other pictures get either inscriptions, what is happening from the Legenda Aurea, or just continuing text. And exactly that very, very rare point, I do not know another prominent manuscript with the same thing, is in this book. And it is very interesting that we have the same sort of seriousness. But when we then turn to understand how the beheading of John the Baptist is done here, and how the figures interact. Salome, the beheader, the saint here, the man comes and brings her the head of the Baptist, and here she stands. And even here, it is all different, because here you have no prominent role of Salome. So it is not what we always find in early Limburg things, repetition, but it's a toying with the same idea. Next thing is, where did they get the idea from? And there is this beautiful story of St. Paul, who speaks too long, so long that a boy falls asleep who had not had a place at the, among the parishes, and so the boy sleeping falls down. And we find that in things like the Anjou, a legendary in the Vatican, and so I'm convinced that our book and a second look at the Belles-Sœurs helps us to understand that the Limburgs must have had such a kind of book, not the Anjou, not the book preserved, to get the inspiration. But that inspiration, once more back to this, was not to have an icon to be repeated, but ideas for narrative to be done in variants. Now, we get to some of the greatest little things in invention. St. John slays the dragon in a way we never see anymore. And then he is a missionary, and as a missionary, he converts the Persian queen. And the Persian queen, Parthian queen, goes and tells her husband, "Now I'm a Christian too." He is upset, and one of his counselors calls for the sword to make her beheaded, and it's the same sword with her blood still on, which will behead St. George. Imagine this kind of tiny idea. I did not find a second picture. It's the rare case that manuscript people who always have too many pictures have to reread the stories of St. George to find an idea what it may be, what it is. And then we could look at comparisons, and there is a strong difference between this picture and the picture in the Belles-Sœurs. One has the impression that in the Belles-Sœurs everything is clear, simpler, iconized. It is something like the formula which then was repeated. And in the same moment we have to look at these horses. They are the same. And then we see how in this case, when the horse appears a second time, also in the Belles-Sœurs, the artist is still working about the foreshortening. That's one of the exciting things when we see drawings. And then we could get more material, like for instance this, and see that St. Nicholas, one of the greatest pictures in the book, is something much more inspired by that strange painter who is working in the original part of the Psalter of Henry VI, than by the Belles-Sœurs. And so I dare to say, this picture, as St. George's picture, is earlier than the correspondent picture in the Belzer. That does not mean that the whole book has been done before the Belzer was started. But when you look at the whole history of the Belzer, you have the problem that the Belzer have so different stages of enrichment. So between the first work on the Belzer and the great end of the Belzer, I place that book. Now, so I'm convinced that, for instance, this drawing of St. Anthony burying Paul the Hermit is earlier than that one, and that the two, I don't show you now the second part of it, that the two pictures in the Belzer come from the same idea which was experienced first here. When we then ask why the hell must it be a true Limburg? Why not just say and be happy it's a Limburg follower? We look at great books of Limburg followers. Les Enluminures have the frail hours. And you could say, well, there is the donkey, there is the Virgin, there is St. John, there is the child, a beautiful landscape. But what's missing? The drive. What a drive is here. What an enormous drive is here. What an enormous drive is here. And now we go to Egypt. When we then look at how the Belzer in greater books, now we take better books like the Spitz Hours, which were, all these books were here in 2005. When we look at that, we see that the Spitzmaster didn't do anything else but repeat it, sometimes with some corrections more intelligent than the version in the Belzer. But here, Jesus changes. St. Peter is kneeling. Judas covers Jesus. So this is not in a row from the Belzer to somewhere. When we then look once how Limburg motifs decayed up to my very beloved Breton late things, we see that at every step the quality of invention decays. And there is not a single one who said, the Limburgs did something well, I do better. That's my real point. And now we see, for instance, this once more. St. Catherine naked in the iconic version of the Belzer, orderly draped, beautifully done. And that was the thing to be repeated. This is of a wilderness of imagination that one could only be astonished about what happens in the head of the draftsman there. But there is the question, could we date a thing with that kind of border earlier than the Belzer with the typical Belzer borders? That this is later, Margaret of Orleans, there's no doubt. But one should perhaps say, border law says this is central. But our book has a problem. The double images have got only borders where an initial is. When you imagine the draftsman who did this, he counted on equality. he did not want to have this picture without border if he wanted a border. He didn't care for borders. So we have to date our borders. And the borders can be dated by the fact that within the book, you see this is the normal corpse of the book, there is at the very end one gathering of 8 leaves put into a gathering of 4 leaves, and the surrounding leaves have this kind of layout, and the things put into have a denser quality of text. And in that part, you find a very strange text in Viam Pacis. That is a text which, it's not my idea, it's not my little fanciness. This text is the text added to the Belle Sœur and added to the Petite Sœur. Over there you can see that the text corresponds to this. Twice illuminated by the Limburgs. Another example is by in a Limburg style, only in a reproduction of the 19th century. The manuscript is no more known. And there is one more example much later. And we are more or less convinced that this text, which is a tiny bit superstitious, that one has to read it when one wants to leave his home and wants to be safe on a journey, that this was done after, on 23rd of November 1407, John the Fearless had assassinated Louis d'Orléans. And when we then look once more at the Lombard way of putting the Annunciation, and at the shields we have here, which are in German Tartschen. In earlier years, German was a strong language for heraldry. Bush shields in English. They are very typical for Lombard things and mostly for the Visconti. And there is a strong Visconti mode at the French court before 1416, more or less before 1407, because Louis d'Orléans had been pretty rich by the fact that he had married Valentina Visconti, and therefore I'm convinced that the book was done for Louis d'Orléans, interrupted at his death, and that this addition was done after his death, and the book never got the pictures because Valentina died a year later.
You right?
Yeah.
That's very,
Just a second, and then we are to the end. The last question is, these borders are 1408, and that fits marvelously because it's exactly the border style we find starting in 1408. And now we see that one could toy with French shields. That's a French shield. That's a shield for the Visconti, or in that case, Tommaso di Saluzzo. When we then end up, I have 3 minutes to end with Saint Jerome. We see that there is that great drawing of Saint Jerome in the Bible, which could not be put together with the Bimoralisé pictures, because you can't put a big frontispiece on such a page. Therefore, the Saint Jerome was put on a double leaf, like the double leaves we have in our Book of Hours. And here I just show you the double leaf. Now we have just to ask, how strong is our literature? We know that the Saint Jerome is by an Italian, is by a goldsmith, is by the master of the Grand Sœur de Rouen. And when we go through motives, we see that his building is repeated by the master, and that even Jan van Eyck's there. And I could make another little joke with Albert Châtelet's attribution of certain drawings of our painter to the young Jan van Eyck, but that's too far from Brugge, I think. It's a wrong way to put this kind of thing in the style of the Lymbourg of Saint Jerome. It is necessary to make a distinction of hands. And the most exciting distinction is between these two pictures. They are on two pages facing each other, not on a double leaf. And one is done by one Limbourg, one is by another. And that other painter on the right-hand side is our painter of Saint Jerome. And the Master of Saint Jerome starts at the beginning of the second gathering in the Bible Moralisée. These pictures are by him, and so I have traces of that hand in the Belzer, in the Bible Moralisée, and I end up with my idea that this artist, interested in architecture, interested in strong compositions, is the one who did the page where Margaret Lawson found a tiny golden P in one of these flags up there. That it's our draftsman, and that is the one who painted the greatest marvel of the world, Mur-sur-Yèvre. So, for me, it's a good solution to say the hours of Louis d'Orléans and Valentina Visconti with drawings by P. de Limburg during work on the Belzer, interrupted 14/7, given up 14/8.